Good evening or good afternoon, depending where you're watching from. My name is Bianca Oortwijn. I'm a librarian at the Zuid-Afrikahuis here in Amsterdam, and I want to welcome you at the 4th episode of Footnotes. I hope you all watched the documentary that we put online on our website, Strike a Rock. If not, don't jump out. It's still really worthwhile to stay in the program. You can still watch the documentary afterwards for a little bit more. Today's topic is the women's activism in South Africa in the aftermath of the 2012 Marikana Massacre and in mining communities in the Zambian Copperbelt. Bringing perspectives from cultural studies, anthropology and visual studies, Nomusa Makubu, Patience Mususa, and Helene Strauss speak with Xenia Robbe and Kylie Thomas about the enduring effects of the first massacre that took place in South Africa after the end of apartheid. Kylie Thomas is senior researcher at the NIOD, the Dutch Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies here in Amsterdam. She writes about photography, visual activism, feminism, queer and anti-racist movements, resistance and protests, and South Africa during and after apartheid. She will give a presentation on the Marikana Massacre, followed by anthropologist Patience Mususa, who will speak about the mining communities in the Zambian Copperbelt. Mususa's research focuses on mining and urbanization, covering issues of inequality and social change. Art historian Nomusa Makubu is associate professor at the University of Cape Town and will follow with her presentation on film and visual activism. The presentations conclude with a contribution of Helene Strauss, who will speak about the importance of the documentary Strike a Rock. Strauss teaches at the University of the Free State in South Africa, and her book Wayward Feeling, Audiovisual Culture and Aesthetic Activism in Post-Rainbow South Africa will appear this July at the University of Toronto Press. As always, you can write your questions in the chat below, or beside, for the Q&A in the end. But first I will give the floor to Xenia Robbe, who researches memories of the 1980s, 1990s transitions in Russian and South African literature and film. She will tell us something about the upcoming workshop in the University of Groningen, which is related to this episode. Enjoy.
Hello everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this discussion today. And a special thanks to Helene, Nomusa and Patience for accepting our invitation and participating in this conversation, which I very much look forward to. I will just start with introducing the topic of the discussion a little bit, as it takes place within the Footnotes series, as well as in the framework of the workshop, which is titled The Poetics and Politics of Strike in the Post-Socialist Post-Colonial Encounter. The workshop will take place at the University of Groningen and online on the 7th and 8th of April. And everyone is welcome to join, especially online. Joining the workshop is free and everyone is invited. The workshop takes inspiration from Veronica Gago's theorization of feminist strike in the Latin American context, of protests for abortion rights, and of activism that centers women's reproductive and productive labor as the backbone of neoliberal economic systems. So to quote from the workshop description, a feminist strike troubles distinctions between formality and informality, employment and unemployment, paid and unpaid labor, productive and reproductive work, or migrant work and work done by nationals. It recognizes and includes rights claims, lived experiences, and spaces inhabited by those who are made invisible by these binary distinctions. As such, a feminist strike provides critical lens through which we can explore material and immaterial connections between radically different bodies, conflicts, and territories, and assemble a diverse politics and poetics of struggle, protest, and liberation across space and time. So with this discussion of Aliki Saragas' Strike a Rock, we'd like to initiate reflection on the potential of bringing this lens of feminist strike into the context of South African feminist movements, particularly those that center on issues of labor, both productive and reproductive. Can this perspective be helpful for understanding contemporary feminisms in South Africa in their historical dynamic? Can it relate women's struggles in post-apartheid context to mobilizations around labor issues elsewhere in other post-colonial as well as post-socialist contexts? As part of the discussion, we'd like to place recent tendencies in South African feminisms within the current international context of using the imaginaries of strike to reframe feminist activism beyond identity politics. The film Strike a Rock alludes to the historical and contemporary manifestations of feminist resistance that foregrounds issues of labor. It does so not only through metaphorical reference, allusion to the line of a famous struggle anti-apartheid song, and to its line, "You strike the woman, you strike the rock." The song was performed during the Women's March in 1956 in Pretoria and on many occasions later. But the film goes beyond that. It represents the daily struggles of women living at Marikana and their ways of political organizing after the massacre. We'd like to speak about how the representations of women's activism and labor in this film gender our understandings of strike, but also how they push perhaps the boundary in this strike idiom that is now used in international women's movements, to reflect on types of work and working people who are invisible, remain invisible, still even within the frameworks of this activism. We might consider how, for example, and whether withholding and restructuring forms of labor as a form of resistance is at all possible, available, and effective for women working in conditions of informal labor. So I hope we'll be able to touch on all these issues, or at least some of them. But for now, I'm passing on the word to Kylie, who will speak about the Marikana strike, the massacre, and their reverberations in South African society today.
Thanks, Xenia, and thanks everyone for being here. So I'd like to begin with an image that is a photograph taken on one of the most notorious days in the history of South Africa, the day of the Sharpeville Massacre, the 21st of March, 1960. On that day, more than 5,000 people gathered outside of a police station in a place not far from Johannesburg to protest against being forced to carry passbooks, documents that were issued by the apartheid state that radically limited and strictly controlled the movements of Black people. Arriving without their passes, the intention of those who gathered there was to give themselves up for arrest. But then what happened was that the police opened fire and within 2 minutes shot 13,000 bullets into the crowd. 69 people were killed and most of them were shot in the back while they were running away. Many more of them were wounded. In the aftermath of the event, the two most important opposition parties in the country, the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress, were banned, their leaders jailed, and thousands of people were arrested. After the end of apartheid, this day was declared Human Rights Day, and it's also the International Day for the Elimination of Racism. On the 16th of August 2012, 34 of the thousands of miners who were participating in a strike at Lonmin Platinum Mine in the Marikana area near Rustenburg were killed by the police. The police encircled the miners and opened fire, shooting at them with automatic rifles. No fewer than 14 of the miners were shot in the back, while others were hunted down and shot at close range as they fled from the police. On the night before the massacre, the police ordered 4,000 rounds of live ammunition and called for mortuary vans to be present at the site. So they clearly anticipated that some of the miners would be shot dead the following day. The Marikana Massacre was the first and hopefully the last to take place in South Africa after the end of apartheid. In many ways, it can be understood as marking the end of the first period of the South African transition, and it has been followed by waves of protests against the persistence of colonial and apartheid-era ideologies and structures, and against the corrupt practices of the current state. In the aftermath of the massacre, a commission of inquiry was held, and although it determined that the actions of the police, the Lonmin Mining Company, and state officials were to blame for the massacre, none of these parties have thus far been held to account. And that includes the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who was implicated in this massacre. The commission failed to interrogate the systemic inequality in the mining industry and the living conditions in the area surrounding the mine, which led to the strike and which are so powerfully portrayed in the film Strike a Rock. In the 3 years that the commission sat, just 1 hour was allocated to the chairperson of Sekala Sonke to articulate the concerns of the women of Marikana. The Marikana Massacre, and in particular the fact that it was so extensively documented through visual media, fundamentally transformed social relations in the post-apartheid state, creating a decided rupture between the post-liberation government and the people. Images taken at Marikana, like the one that you can see on the screen here, which appeared in the newspapers very soon after the massacre took place, and other media created in the aftermath of the massacre, including documentary films, expand, disrupt, and exceed the juridical frame, refuse the containment of the Commission of Inquiry, and insist that the post-apartheid state be held to account. Although women live and work in Marikana, most accounts of the strike and the massacre, almost without exception, focus entirely on men. And the film that we are focusing on today makes an additional and critical intervention in bringing the lives and stories of women into view. And we are very happy to be joined today by Patience, Nomusa, and Helene to speak about this very critical issue with us on Human Rights Day. Thank you. I'm going to hand over now to Nomusa.
For that introduction. I just remembering also the importance of making those connections between the Sharpeville Massacre and the Marikana Massacre. And also thank you for bringing us together for this discussion. I recall back in 2017 when Strike a Rock was screened at the University of Cape Town. And I remember thinking, what an important time film. Yes, the labor of women in everyday struggles of Marikana, but the labor of Black women in general are eclipsed by androcentric meta-narratives. So in hindsight, this is also a gap, I guess, in my own work. In the past few years, I've focused on artists whose collectives, on artist collectives and public scripting in interventions such as those, for example, in the Tokolo Stencil's work, The Man in the Green Blanket, Mambush, and I usually talked about the iconicity as a way to address the ongoing crisis of structural and spatial racism. So since 2012, stencils, fly posting, and graffiti depicting the man in the green blanket have punctuated public city walls in South Africa. And it was based on a photograph that was taken by the photojournalist Leon Sadiki. And the image depicts the mine worker Mgcineni Noki, who, as I mentioned earlier, is known as Mambushed, who during the strike was dressed in a green blanket with one fist in the air and the other carrying a spear. So Mambush is considered a martyr and has become a powerful symbol of the continued racialization of labor and the debasement of particularly Black migrant laborers from former apartheid homelands and from neighboring countries in South Africa's mining sector. So the proliferated image of the man in the green blanket explicitly links South Africa's flourishing economy with race-based, gendered class disparity. So public scripting signified for me, I guess, in those years, those borders and reflecting the history of the regulated, racialized movement, as well as labor exploitation. And it also showed how South African cities, which were constructed through racialized wage labor, are inherently gendered, conflictual spaces. So it is significant that Striker Rock hones in on how the mammoth machine of the economic apartheid comes to bear on the relationships between the women of Marikana and particularly Sekhala Sonke. Before I talk about what I'm going to do, I also just wanted to quickly show this image of how the symbolism also comes in terms of the live performances that have happened on campus. This was a photograph that I took at the anniversary of the Rhodes Must Fall protests at UCT. And again, the green blanket begins to symbolize that. But what I wanted to do was to, maybe I'll come back to this image later, was to address 4 key issues, in feminist activist work that are probed. 1, the question of micro and macro solidarity, and the very distinctive struggle repertoires of women's movements. And then 3, affective labor, and 4, the understanding the locus of negotiations with otherwise duplicitous big corporations and government. So we've seen how such duplicity was staged by Lonmin in the spirit of negotiations, revealing the utter cynicism of capitalism. And this is what the film really just makes very palpable. So this and that point is brilliantly captured by Mam Primrose in the film, where she says in Parliament, "Nikhohlakele," which means you are evil. And it's at that moment, it's there in that moment where we begin to realize that Black women's struggles are forced into a series of battles in what can be called a war of attrition. It's tragic to see how Lonmin and the government continue to use various strategies to string women activists along, to protract negotiations unnecessarily, to keep shifting the goalposts as a way of tiring and wearing out individuals. It's like waging a psychological war precisely to break down the relationships that are at the very foundation of social organizing. So given the limited time, I've decided to structure this presentation on the basis of 5 stills to address the 5 key loci. So the first still, which you see here, which of course speaks to solidarity particularly. So it's a powerful image where Mam Primrose, after working tirelessly to organize for the rally, is left out. And we see Mam Thumeka on the other side of the fence. And we begin to see how this also just highlights the micro and macro solidarity, which are interwoven. So, of course, we start to zoom in on the domestic space, something that Kamalita Naika, my colleague, writes really well about. So that micro solidarity that goes really a long way, but also that domestic space, that home space or home scale solidarity is transformed into something else. So it's far reaching in that sense. But also this particular solidarity, this particular separation here, this fence, in some ways can be seen as a metaphor in which there's a perplexing of solidarity among Black people, right? So the failure of the political community in terms of the political parties. So solidarity, whether civic, social, cultural, or political, is volatile. It is vital, but it is predicated on volatile, uneven, constrained, and neocolonially bound societies. So the strategies that we see, right? So gathering, assembling, caring, and generally strategies for survival reflect a kind of fluid solidarity. And fluid solidarity, I think, in this particular instance becomes, important because it refers to that kind of organic work of organizing civil society, and it recognizes the ever-changing meanings and the basis upon which different kinds of solidarity are formed. And it's distinct from what Mohamed Bamia refers to as solid solidarity. Fluid solidarity refers to the frames of affiliation and agendas that are not coterminous with state ideologies, whereas solid solidarity defines the hierarchical and state-led notions of collectivity. But in general, of course, and I think as Bamia also mentions, solidarity essentially is fluid in nature. And again, this sort of complicates in terms of the internal conflicts within the movement, within movements that are often led by women, but also, of course, the broader national scale solidarity and also movements. So over time, again, what we begin to see is something quite interesting about the ways that we think about political organizing, but also the sort of human resilience that it requires. So over time, as the memory slowly fades from public discourse and as the iconic images are absorbed into futile rhetoric, the continued labor of woman is pushed farther and farther from the center. And we see how solidarity work may also spiral into fatigue and sometimes indifference. So I'm reminded of the way in which Peace Kigua spoke about this sort of this notion of fatigue in her keynote, which she presented in 2021 at the African Feminisms Conference, where she pointed to, and I quote her here, the diminished capacity to empathize with other people's pain. And I think when you go through the film, you just think this recurrent image of the squalor of the areas where Black people live is an image we've seen so many times, that one begins to feel as though, is it, is this empathy beginning to be drained, right? So, and here in her words, in Kigua's words, she says, people looking from outside reach a point where no one wants to know anymore, no one wants to hear, or no one can hear in the proliferation of imagery. So Kigua points out that there's a destructive base of organizing and the disappointment of failed communities, and it comes through in this film in very interesting ways. And I guess it's the contradictions that make it so incredibly poignant. So she says there's a destructive base and the disappointment of failed communities, which cease to be spaces of care, but become the source of hurt. I think at this moment in the film, when we look at Mum Primrose's face, right, in this kind of disappointment, while she's looking on at the VIPs on stage, meanwhile, she's on the outside. So Kigua points to the psychopolitics of care as particularly integral to how we think about feminist organizing. And she warns of the interiority and which shifts attention away from the social and political conditions. She recalls what Audre Lorde referred to as the shedding of each other's psychic blood and asks, what does it mean to come together in our woundedness? The women of Marikana were brought together through collective mourning. And then, of course, we're being failed by government again and again, as well as opposition parties and organization. I guess also the NGOs, that sort of muffle the voices of the women themselves. But the women in that sort of collective mourning continue to wage a number of wars at various levels, and in terms of the political parties that are ineffective in the pursuit of justice. So here, the juice of feminist organizing, of feminist activism, is relegated on care and solidarity. But there is such precarity internally with allies and so on. And in order not to lose sight of the main objective, it's important to sustain that ability to create the humanizing spaces that will ensure the capacity for resilience in the war of attrition. So, and again, I'm drawing very quickly again from Peace Kigua, who cites Matsilo Motsei, who says it's actually important here to bring in healing-centered care as opposed to trauma-centered care, where she raises that there's this sort of need for the renewal of the soul that follows a path that cannot be legislated for in parliament. And it's a way of finding a spark that will trigger a loving and compassionate way of being with who we are after being told that we are of no substance and value. Kigua asks, what can care look like under racialized capitalism? What are the freeing functionalities of care therein? And what are the oppressive functionalities of care therein? And these questions are instructive, especially considering the oft-cited statements by Audre Lorde, where she says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that in itself is an act of political warfare. And Angela Davis, who argues that radical self-care means we're able to bring our entire selves to the movement. So care, of course, is an act of solidarity. It can be redemptive, but it's not an end in itself. And it exists in the messy, convoluted, and volatile relationships that are forged within political communities. The second one is this particular image, and I realize that I'm quickly running out of time. And Kali, I can see your face, so just make a hand movement when I'm overindulging. So in this image, very Marie Antoinette-esque. The leaders of the EFF movement staged this spectacular indulgence, highlighting the distinction that should be made between struggle repertoires of androcentric political parties, groupings, and movements, as opposed to those led by women. We've seen how this fetishization of individual heroes and celebration of false victories also impacted on Fallist movements in the past few years. And we'll remember that Fallism, in fact, was, one of the things that precipitated Fallism was also the Marikana Massacre, amongst other things. So although it was, with Fallism, although it was the radical feminists, the women and transgender scholars, such as Shaira Kala, Gialeboger Maseramaru, Mbali Matandela, Wanelisa Kaba, and Sandile Ndelu, amongst others, who led the Fallist movement, the narrative remains masculine. So writing in 2015, Mbali Matandela asserts that we knew how easily patriarchy can dominate any context, and even protests about equal rights. And Black radical feminists were not going to let the movement become one of them. So it's therefore important, and she argues, to voice the pain that Black females experience based on how the ideal of the personality of an elite white male has influenced how Black men treat Black women and LGBTQIA people. And these are the struggles that we're facing from within the movements, as gendered marginalization through varied forms of violence. And the struggle repertoires of creative revolutions, or what I've called creative protests, render the rage and disillusionment and resistance into powerful public resistance, because they use visual and creative modes that are poignantly familiar, but appeal to the social conscience. They're not always about aggressive demonstrations, but also about humanizing each other. I mean, the number of times we see the women hugging and kissing is just incredible as a form of protest. The challenge is to take the artistic strategies, but also the social human strategies into everyday life and form links with grassroots movements. So the creative revolution in film, live arts, offers multiple ways of understanding the intersectional struggles because it readily facilitates the shift from the personal to the political. And it's self-reflexive and responsive to the fast evolving but insidious contemporary colonialities that threaten to co-opt it. The third is, of course, this image, the response to the cutting of the cake. And the woman says, but we're not eating the cake, right? But there's, a number of issues I wanted to point out here, but because we don't have time, I'll focus just on affective labor. So earlier, Senior, you mentioned the different types of labor, but also what we begin to see here in this film, and I think in a lot of the works that artists and creatives have put out there in response to Marikana, is affective labor. And the fact that affective labor is unremunerated, it's unrecognized. The work of solidarity is hard work. It differs from extracted, exploited, undervalued, abused labor under capitalist conditions. So one's physical and cognitive labor determines social standing, and to a certain extent, the communities that one becomes part of. So as decommodified, affective labor and solidarity entails working on the building of relationships, whether between individuals, communities, institutions, etc. And it's interesting to see how all of that sort of, turns in on itself in the way that labor, not only is it overlooked, but in the work of protesting, it's the poor, it's the women that are then blamed and seen as, the poverty is seen as self-perpetuating, then the poor are blamed for their own demise. So the process of internal differentiation between classes within South Africa's racial categories convolutes those class, race, and gender debates. And the discourse about the Mambush image intersects with older debates about race and gender in South Africa. Moreover, it draws attention to the class divisions among Black people and the hostility towards the growing Black capitalist class, who are generally regarded as political sellouts. So that is, the iconic image of Mambush represents the triadic conjunction between the Black dispossessed laborer and the emergent Black capitalist, as well as the overarching white capitalist, the ultimate negation of Black women. And the fourth image, of course, is this sort of very interesting contrast between the attendance of the mining in Daba and the alternative mining in Daba, where, of course, you have this sort of chimerical presence of capital with this glass pane that separates them. And again, it sort of works, it sort of speaks to this war of attrition where promises are made, but the question is, the table, when we come to the table of negotiation, is capital actually going to negotiate in good faith? Whereas, of course, capital isn't meant to do that. Theirs is to compete with other mining companies rather than to negotiate in good faith. And so there's a very interesting way of speaking around not only solidarities, but the kinds of relationship that women have to negotiate. And of course, those strategies and struggle repertoires then become particularly important in understanding that kind of duplicity in those relationships. And the last one, the embrace, which of course, I think in many ways sort of speaks to this general sort of strategy, survival strategy of these women. This is at a point where after they've had the conflict between the two friends, they are brought by one of the other members of the movement to come and speak, to resolve their issues. But again, I think, one can begin to see here how that will be the one point, and I think the sort of pivotal aspect of these movements will be this notion of solidarity, but understanding that the significance of care as protesting. So in response to the precarity and desolation that's precipitated by crisis, there is a revived urgency and solidarity through the ethics of care, healing, self-preservation, and other contingencies of survival. And therefore, care is fundamental to social movements. And I think I'll end there, and we'll switch off my slide so that Helen can also continue, but thank you so much for their time to present.
Thank you. I'm just waiting for the slides to come on. Okay. While I wait for that, I will just say thank you to Kylie, Xenia, and the organizers at Zuid-Afrikahuis for inviting me to be part of this panel. And thank you to Nomusa for this wonderful, in many ways connects with some of the things that I want to work through very briefly in my notes today. So my contribution today grows out of a number of entangled projects concerned with exposing the environmental and health costs of extractive violence. These costs, as the social theorist Catherine Yusuf puts it, were knowingly exported to Black and Brown communities under the rubric of civilization, progress, modernization, and capitalism, and are very much at the heart of the activist work done by Thumeka, Marikana, and Primrose Santi, the two grandmothers that Nomusa just spoke about as well, and are at the heart of this film, Striker Rock. Much of my work in recent years has traced the intersection of aesthetics, visual culture, feminist activism, and forms of violence at once human and ecological. Returning to Saragas's film in preparation for this talk made me realize again how important it is to consider these intersections, particularly for how they might direct our collective attentions to the work of deep healing. The work of deep healing done in communities such as Nkaneng by women whose socially reproductive labors have long been both exploited and invisibilized by the mining industry. This is the care work, I guess, that Nomusa emphasized in her presentation. Since writing the article on Striker Rock that got me invited to this panel, I've gravitated towards work that explicitly foregrounds possibilities of feminist repair and regeneration in the aftermath of trauma, and the kind of healing work that Machila Motsei writes about as well, that Nomusa referenced. And I'm interested in what Rupa Maria and Raj Patel in their recent book, Inflamed, called Deep Medicine, namely the act of repairing those relationships that have been damaged through systems of domination. Maria and Patel's work connects with a large body of decolonial, feminist, and indigenous thinking that views the future of human life as inseparable from the life-enabling futures of non-human ecologies and atmospheres. And it is this relational accountability that the film Striker Rock offers as a counterpoint to the extensive harms inflicted by the mining industry since the start of the so-called mineral revolution in the 19th century in South Africa. So the genre of the documentary film, which is increasingly prominent as a site of South African social critique, arguably emerged as one of the leading cultural forms for mediating rage in the aftermath of the 2012 Marikana Massacre. The film has been particularly valuable and a particularly valuable intervention in this space for at least two reasons. First, the film has been key in countering the gross underrepresentation of Black women's struggles in mainstream or mainstream cultural mediation of the massacre and of the mining industry more broadly, as feminist scholars such as Asanda Benya and Simamkele Mitlakwavu and Nomusa reminded us at length. Tied to this first point, the film has obviously also been instrumental in exposing these counter-role dismissal used by Lonmin Platinum and the state to outmaneuver the activist efforts of Sekala Sanke. This kind of chimerical presence of capital that haunts the work that these women do, that Nomusa spoke about. So secondly, and this is the point I want to pause on briefly here, the significance of the documentary lies for me in large part in its foregrounding of a regenerative feminist aesthetics of care. So we can see the many points of connection between my and Nomusa's presentation as a rejoinder to extractive capitalism's slow and persistent violence. So I want to also just do a brief close reading of just a few scenes from the film to help me make the point. The first is found right at the start of the film, and it comprises a panoramic aerial shot across a large quarry of mining detritus adjacent to the mine, steadily overlaid with visuals of the soapy hands of Marikana as she washes laundry in slow motion. As the film's visual focus shifts towards her hands, she states in voiceover, Marikana is a place of contrast, and that was before the massacre. The second scene consists of an overhead shot rising above the township of Mkaneng in Wonderkoop, as the dusty streets and makeshift housing are gradually abstracted into the recognizable geometry of a cartographic grid. These frames then dissolve into a silhouette shot of the Lonmin grounds cast in harsh industrial light. The flashes of a lightning storm coloring the twilight sky in dystopian purples and yellows. Accompanying these visuals, Marikana's voice can be heard stating, Lonmin is only about 200 meters away from my home, the informal shack settlement of Mkaneng. Mkaneng means to take away the land by force. We have no electricity, but 200 meters away, Lonmin's lights shine all night. These scenes are echoed throughout the film as Saragas repeatedly visualizes examples of failing energy in the film's primary affective anchor. One of the most iconic of these scenes is that of a woman gathering wood under the bulking form of an electricity transmission tower, accompanied by the following lines spoken in a child's voice. The sun has faded on our fathers and brothers. You promised us freedom, but you brought rubbish. You promised us rights, but you brought us death. It is no accident that the film keeps returning to visuals that reveal the energy contradictions at the center of the platinum industry's relationship with the local people on whose productive and socially reproductive labor it relies. Whereas the South African mining industry to this day remains the beneficiary of cheap subsidized electricity, energy use practices in Mkaneng are characterized by what Warren Currier calls energy intimacy, namely a state in which those living beyond the reach of national energy grids necessarily have direct and personal relationships with the sources of their energy. The film's deliberate focus on these energy intimacies also serves as a reminder of the coevalness of multiple energy temporalities that shockingly still characterize the South African present, where the energy wealth of some coexists with the energy wants that appear to be of an earlier time. The scene of Marikana's hand superimposed onto shots of the mining quarry landscape echoes a similar shot, included slightly later in the film, as footage of the South African police opening fire on the striking miners is juxtaposed with shots of the blood-stained soil at the site of the massacre, and again, of Marikana's laundry washing hands. The filmmaker offers viewers a deliberate graphic match here between a piece of red cloth included in the laundry shown to be washed and the red blood on the ground. The landscape visualized in the film is thus one deliberately overlaid and affectively charged with vast histories of both human and ecological trauma. These scenes expose a South African energy legacy that continues to rely on two types of extraction for its survival, namely, first and most obviously, of mineral energy, in this case platinum, and second, of the muscular and psychic energies harvested from laboring bodies in the realms of both production and social reproduction. Women's bodies literally become the sources of their own energy as they hand wash clothing in the absence of electricity infrastructure. In other words, as Jennifer Wenzel points out, industrialization shift from a muscular economy to a mechanical economy in the 19th and 20th century is still not, in fact, fully achieved, as the mining industry is still being sustained by the continued extraction of muscular energy on the part of men and women who labor in the mines themselves and in the community surrounding the mines, and of the domestic and emotional affective labors of Marikana, Santi, and the other women who are trying to return their community to health in the aftermath of the massacre and of trauma. These exhausting labors, which obviously registers for anyone who watches the film, are shown to take a heavy toll on the women of Sekhala Sonke as they try to mitigate the wide-ranging consequences of industrial pollution, economic precarity, structural sexism, gender-based violence, and environmental racism through the deep medicine of crying together, as the name of the organization Sekhala Sonke also suggests. For a documentary, as Nomusa also pointed out, the film is genuinely remarkable for how relentlessly it visualizes the somatic, outwardly expressive dimensions of feeling, as interpersonal emotional care for the women of Sekhala Sonke is shown to be embodied in the gentle haptics of supportive physical contact. And I also have a lot of these sort of embrace shots. The film includes countless scenes of women either talking about their grief, crying, or pausing in prolonged embrace, either with one another or with the children in the community, in effect foregrounding the long-term regenerative ethical labor of these women as they engage with one another and their everyday domestic environments in the wake of the massacre. I'm almost done, so I'll just 2 more sentences. It's safe to say then that scenes of affective interpersonal physicality of women shown in close-up cinematographic embrace occupy at least as much screen time in the film as do scenes that reference failing energy and sanitation infrastructure. By interweaving these scenes with some of the most standard visual and stylistic conventions of documentary form, the film deliberately activates viewer engagement across somatic and semiotic, intellectual and affective registers. As a mode of aesthetic activism, then, the film draws viewers into intimate sensory proximity with the felt reality of the women of Nkaneng, which serves in turn as a visceral reminder that the struggle for justice for women in this and other mining communities in South Africa is far from over. Thank you.
Thank you, Helene, and thank you everyone for organizing this event. I think the film Strike a Rock allows us to sort of think about women's struggles in extractive locales, also beyond South Africa. It's the Marikana Massacre effectively was a sort of, I think allowed people to sort of, it was that one of those moments of convergence where the sort of struggles and the violence and the struggle for livelihood and basically a decent life came to the fore. And in my own work on the Zambian Copperbelt, we can share the slide. In my own work on the Zambian Copperbelt, effectively looking at the extractive industry, copper mining, and effectively the waning of struggles for decent living and housing within these sort of extractive locales, and also sort of effectively how in these sort of boom and busts and shifting political economic context, these struggles effectively in a sense universal and characterized especially following the sort of 2000s and the consolidation of neoliberal economic restructuring, effectively the retreat of the state and the retreat of the state in being able to be present. And one sees that in one of the early statements in the film, where the key protagonists effectively say, we need the government to solve this problem. Where is the state? And this is key in being able to think about what the film sort of highlights in broad context. It's about women's struggles and women's work in extractive locales and also expectations of welfare, socioeconomic mobility, and effectively a good life. And one sees that in the kind of solidaristic organizing that within those particular spaces, people are also sort of struggling effectively for a space for communion. As they cry together, they're also finding an effective space. And in Zambia's Copperbelt, in linking back to the expectations and ideals of domesticity, women, you had the sort of conundrum in that when mining was established in the Zambian Copperbelt at the turn of the 20th century, it was very much like in the South African context, organized effectively for male labor with very little women's space created, and women were not expected to be within the mine towns. But women were present, children were present, and effectively it was also about a struggle for finding a place. Now, in the mine workers, Black African mine workers organized for decent wages and labor, with women organizing along them. The struggles effectively, more as the corporations effectively met some of those demands, it morphed into a particular idea of what domesticity in extractive locales should look like. So it was the whole idea of, the housewife, and you had these sort of home workers classes, effectively women's lives being organized to fit a particular idea of domesticity and in the town, but also within an industrial context. And this, of course, sort of went up against women's own struggles, effectively to make a living. Women in the towns were brewing beer, they were trading, and they were engaging in a whole range of other economic activities. And so this women's presence sort of destabilizes these notions of as a male space. And with around the 1950s, and this is what shows effectively what's possible within the South African context in terms of that, to some extent, the film shows a sense of futility, but actually one can see, in a sense, by being able to have their voices represented politically, being able to carve out a space, being able to effectively shape and contribute to the African mining vision towards the end and push that particular agenda, one sees progressive steps, but they're not enough. And that clearly becomes apparent towards the end of the film. In the Zambian context, effectively housing, welfare, and all those sort of struggles consolidated into sort of a post-colonial vision of what the African state should be and should deliver. Effectively, when in that sort of post-independence context, it adopted a developmental state agenda, i.e., where the state was present. But this, in effect, also fit in with a particular idea of corporate culture, which was industrial welfarism, which around the 1950s, at least in the Zambian context, started taking shape, where housing, water and sanitation gets built. But around the 2000s, actually from about the mid-1990s, with the implementation of structural adjustment policies, these mines that had effectively been established in this particular context and had been progressively nationalized in the sort of post-independence period effectively become reprivatized. And you have a similar logic to what you see within Marikana, i.e., the mines are resold. The state retreats. It retreats from the provision of welfare. People are then responsible for their own housing. They're responsible effectively for creating their own work. They're forced to become entrepreneurs. And within this context, women find themselves not just within the domestic space and also sort of engaging in economic life where they are trading, but they also become miners themselves. So there and their children get found at the mine site. They are crushing rocks, remining the slag heaps on the Zambian Copperbelt, and this, in effect, why you ask, why are they there? And this effectively links in to the struggles for survival in a context where the state has retreated. And so as they mine, in their neighborhoods, you have this sort of landscape that was characterized by bougainvillea bushes and growing mango trees. Effectively, there they begin to sell flagstone from the slag heaps. And in that, it effectively shows, in a way, a rethinking and a sort of major shift in the political economy of extractive locales. In effect, an undoing of a developmental state and an idea of urban welfare, effectively taking us, at least in the Zambian Copperbelt context, to the Marikana moment, where people are struggling and they're asking, where is the state? This is what it should be doing. And has the state's role become effectively a key purveyor for capital rather than for the interests of its people? It also leaves us asking a question of who benefits effectively from mineral resources. And in the film, we're reminded that these should be a shared resource, shared by the people who labor in those settings, but actually in a broader context, effectively shared as a national resource. And it leaves, and there actually in the documentary, there's an interesting, the women's membership in a political party in Marikana that effectively calls for the nationalization of the mining industry, creates an interesting point of thinking of, within that, if the industry is a shared national resource, what space is there for the kinds of, there's no space for sort of an unpresent state, and the state is expected to deliver. And the question then we're left with is what kind, if the women of Marikana were allowed to reshape this vision of a resource that is shared, in the everyday life, in the everyday organizing, it gives us an idea, at least a possibility of the world that they might shape. They mention housing and decent housing. They refer back to water. They refer back to electricity. And I think it's in sort of broader perspective, those women's struggles and women's struggles in those particular contexts might, and their calls for a particular kind of state might give us insight into the kind of societies that we want to build. Ones where justice is put at the forefront, and also a solidaristic perspective is appreciated and is key, and one also where that effective space of troubles, but coming together to solving them becomes key. And I think I'll refer back to maybe Kylie.
Everyone for brilliant presentations today. And yeah, so much to think about. And we have some time for questions. We have quite a few questions already that people have sent in. And unfortunately, with the kind of system that we're working with, we can't see who's asking the questions. And we can't see people's faces. But we'd like to say thank you to the people who are out there sending in their questions. And the first question was something that Helene, you spoke quite a lot about in your presentation, and so in some ways I think is addressed, but it's of course a huge issue, and that is about the connections between what happened in Marikana and environmental issues, and that's really a euphemism for talking about the kinds of situations people are forced to live in Marikana, and that's made clear through some of the scenes in the film about the kind of work that goes into making the space habitable, trying to keep the water out of one's home, these kinds of things. So someone has asked about that, and in some ways I think you've addressed that, but related to that question was from the same person. They said, I would also be interested in hearing about place-based attachments. How and why do the women come to value the environment of Marikana, and why do they call it home? And that, again, I think is a complex one that the patients has partially addressed now. And some of it, of course, is not to do with choice, but in other ways, some of the things lie in what we've been speaking about solidarity and community and belonging. Yeah, exemplified maybe in that scene with the fence, and on which side of it you are. Yeah. So yeah, I wonder if anybody would like to address that.
What I found really interesting in rewatching the film is I noticed again, because I've been thinking about air and breathing a lot, a number of shots in the film with these industrial towers and smoke billowing out of the towers. And interestingly, just on Friday, we heard that the deadly air case, I don't know if you know about the deadly air case, it's a case that has been going on for a while, that was initiated by the organization's Groundworks, I think, or Ground Up, and the Vukani Environmental Justice Movement. I'm not sure exactly what the title is, but they were basically taking the state and Eskom to task for the incredible pollution in specifically the Mpumalanga Highveld, where Marikana is also located, where Eskom was established to be the worst emitter, the worst power company in terms of emissions of sulfur dioxide on the planet. And the community took the company to the High Court in Pretoria on Friday. The decision was delivered that the state is in fact accountable to enforcing environmental regulations surrounding clean air. But the question of sort of the suffocating nature of the work, certainly in the mines as well, that the men have been dealing with for very long, the silicosis and tuberculosis epidemics that are unparalleled in world history, resulting from gold mining. All of that, of course, compounds the effects of trauma that these women are dealing with post Marikana Massacre very, very concretely. But it stretches over a century of the kind of psychic and bodily effects of mining on the people in the community. And the work of deep healing, I think, that the women are doing is so crucial, because it addresses embodied harm at a structural level and at a larger social level. But of course, the sort of the strategies of the state are, as Nomusa also pointed out, like very debilitating and just fatiguing. Anyway, so that's all I'm going to say about that just now.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to come to this question around place-based attachment, which I think, Kylie, you also spoke, you kind of addressed that in quite succinctly. But again, I mean, I think it sort of, it highlights the misperceptions around the organization of space in South Africa, and especially why much of the work that women do gets eclipsed, but also particularly the way that we understand Black communities in South Africa. So for the person that asked that question, now it's obviously places like Marikana, or places near mining areas or mining towns would have been created precisely to bring in that labor. And I think, Patience, you really just painted that picture really well in your presentation. The other thing I wanted to mention was that there's now a Marikana in Cape Town, and there's several other Marikanas being, sort of people claiming the name. So not necessarily being attached to place, but the claiming of the name becomes a really sort of powerful thing, right? So this duplication or replication of Marikanas is in itself sort of a symbolic thing in which people are sort of, making sure that there's a memorialization that is not the same as sort of, building statues or making, but but memorializing in terms of look at the sort of self-perpetuating structural inequality that one can't solve. And I know there's been a lot of sort of interventions around starting food gardens in Marikana, and it's hard to actually sustain those things in the context of a toxic environmentally racist situation. So unless you change those spatial arrangements, it would be very hard to sustain even those very necessary interventions such as food gardens. As a small scale as they are, and you have open sewage pipes, both the government isn't taking responsibility, the mine isn't taking responsibility. It's a self-defeating exercise.
Thank you. Thanks. And Xenia, I think you have a question for Pete.
That we prepared for all the speakers, and then we'll be returning to some of the questions from the audience that we received. So my first question is for Patience. Thanks so much for painting this picture of the dynamic of gendered labor and the changing status of women from this idealized domesticity to post-1990s women being pushed into informal labor and conducting informal labor. So I was wondering in this context, how women today, the people in general who you worked with, but also women in particular, how they remember the pre-privatization time. Is there a degree of idealization, so which is also might be implied in this question in the film, where is the state? And as a repeated also injunction, as I understood, on the Copperbelt. And I'm wondering about that, because that made me think about nostalgia, and particularly critical nostalgia in context of deindustrialization in various places of the world, but I'm more familiar with it in Eastern European context, also since the 90s and since the introduction of neoliberalism. So, of course, there are limits to the efficacy of this nostalgia, but at the same time, it might mobilize people and might create communities, particularly these spaces of affect, of shared emotion and care. So I was wondering, what does it look like in Zambia?
Yeah, no, thanks, Senya. I mean, it's a really interesting question because nostalgia is linked also to sort of different ways of remembering, and this is intergenerational as well. And I would say it's also linked into people's experience of landscape and place. So in the context for many of my informants, I mean, they could point to the former community development centers effectively that offered the prospect for upskilling and an idea of social mobility. And this, of course, was not untroubled. Exactly, because there was a part of this was also the creation of an idea of domesticity that was linked in very much to this sort of patriarchal context of the ideal homework, woman homeworker within the home. At the same time, within that, as they refer to these sort of mining welfare centers that effectively formed part of the past and the pre-privatized past, connected to that was also people's memories of struggling for better wages. There were often women and children were oftentimes along marching, demanding better wages and living conditions. They also remember that it was through these kinds of organizing and solidarity that they were able to get sort of childcare benefits. So effectively, the creation progressively of what at one point one described as a sort of cradle to grave kind of corporate welfare setting, which of course then gets rolled back. So the nostalgia in this particular context becomes also a way of politically reminding people that the state was present and corporations could actually behave differently because this is what they did. So as women at the mine site, and they're there working, and their children are not in school, they're struggling or carrying and selling flagstone in front of their yards and engaging in this industry of which, it's a very, very dirty and polluting industry and the like. They're effective phenomenologically embedded in this space, and effectively their whole sort of affective, and also one would almost sort of call it the sort of biosocial, they're sort of biosocial beings, effectively are carrying this burden. So nostalgia is not just a memory; it is also affective and real in the retreat of the state.
Thanks so much, Patience. And I think I'll pass on to Kylie, who will ask also a few questions that we received from.
Yes, so we have something that we anticipated people might ask about what's happened to the woman in the film subsequent to the film, because it was released a little while back, and has anything improved? And also the person who put in this question is saying that they understand that the massacre didn't seem to lead to, I think what they mean here is accountability. It didn't seem to stick to the position of those responsible. So in other words, what happened to people in positions of power afterwards? And as we know, of course, Cyril Ramaphosa, who appeared at the Commission of Inquiry, is now the president. Nathi Mthethwa, who was the Minister of Police at the time, got demoted, became the Minister of Arts and Culture, and various other things like that. And nobody's been called to account, people in high positions. But so the question is really, how are the women in the film doing? And unfortunately, Aliki Saragas could not be with us today, although has been in conversation with us around the film, and she may be better placed to answer that. But we did a little bit of background, internet searching, and found out Mum Primrose is still a member of the EFF and is still in Parliament. And that's the second part of this question. Has Primrose's political position at least been of any positive influence on improvement of the living conditions in Marikana or the wages of the miners? And yeah, I don't know if anybody would like to take that on, but yeah, I mean, unfortunately, since the mine Lonmin was taken over by Sibanye Stillwater, and that was in 2019. Conditions there have not radically improved at all, as far as I know. And that's as of the most recent articles that I've seen around these questions come from last year. So I doubt too much has happened, but I don't know if anybody would like to address that, about how Primrose's political position has maybe improved living conditions in Marikana, or the wages of miners. It may in some ways point to the limits of, I don't know, what's possible when you're an MP, right? And just even if we think about some of those scenes, like the way that she's in a way treated in Parliament, it's quite disturbing for me, actually.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think also it's unfair to place the burden of accountability on a single individual, especially, so I mean, having her as an MP and then expecting that to actually have any changes, that even as Sikala Songe, is really hard to get Lonmin to actually come to the table. And in some ways, I think, it's an unfair ask to place on Primrose on Mum Primrose alone. But you're right. I mean, the scene where she says she will not withdraw the remarks she made about Cyril Ramaphosa as a criminal and as a thief. And even recently, I mean, just this utter cynicism, very recently, Cyril Ramaphosa said in Parliament, he fears fuck all. And then they said he must withdraw. And he says, yes, I withdraw, but I withdraw fuck all. It's just,
Yeah, I saw that. I mean, yeah, quite something. Yeah.
When I did a bit of internet research on this, I discovered that Mum Thumeka is now running bead making and sewing projects in the community, but also shockingly that Sibanye-Stillwater did a study and found, following its acquisition, that 75.3% of women in the area were unemployed. And they also found cases of kwashiorkor, of like extreme malnutrition in the area. So in many ways, things have become worse since the massacre.
Yeah, and I think it's really disturbing the way in which there was a sort of takeover, and then as if all the problems would go away, like at least no longer be stuck to Lonmin, which, and I'm not sure everyone out there knows that it stands for London Mining, and so yeah, it brings in the way in which it's the forms of capitalist exploitation in the country are also on foreign territory too, and from former colonizers, and yeah, so there's kind of a complex mix of what's happening within the country and the role of people from the outside. It's not an internal struggle. Let's put it that way. It's certainly a transnational, multinational, something that affects people all around the world in different ways. And I think that connects back to this larger politics of feminist strike, with which Xenia began this discussion. And maybe this is in some way a good point to bring in some images that Xenia and I would like to share for us all to reflect on. And these are images that are primarily from, so yeah, not these images that we've already all seen of the massacre itself, which will remain with me forever. And with everyone, I think, in South Africa, chilling images. But these are images made during the time of apartheid that recall the long struggle for justice. And I think that this connects to the last question we received from someone, a member of the public who's with us, and who has put a question in the chat, as well as a question that I think Xenia will ask too. And the question from the person who asked this question in the chat, they refer to the end of the film, and after the two central protagonists in the film reconcile, Mam Primrose and Mam Thumeka, we look upon them sitting there disappointed. The open ending left me feeling as if they were almost defeated, as if none of the activism would help. Okay, so this kind of disappointment and, yeah, I don't know, just in a way, the kind of tragedy of it. And the question is, how does that rhyme with the feminism and call for justice with that the rest of the film is filled with, right? So these, and I think, Nomusa, you spoke about this really beautifully in your presentation about the complexities of this and the ways in which these forms of solidarity are, yeah, it's complex, and yeah, that there is this disappointment and defeat alongside these moments of triumph in some way or something like that. And so this whole, I don't know, this history of overcoming, right? This idea of overcoming apartheid, and then the question of when the massacre took place, where does that leave us now? And that's, I mean, to me, it's a big question that the film poses, really. Yeah.
Share the slides, but I'm not sure that it worked. Yeah, it worked. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I hope that.
Disappointment at the end, and I don't know, in some ways maybe this reminder of the struggle being very long, and that things do get overcome, but they also remain with us, and that this struggle is never over, right? The moments like in the film of a luta continua, but then the sense of like, well, when do we get to rest? You know, is it always going to be this endless struggle? And yeah, and for who, right? Like that for some people, okay, maybe that, liberation has come, and for others, we live with the benefits of that, and for others, it certainly has not. Yeah. So this kind of paradox, I guess, or something about the way in which feminism and this call for justice are alongside something that feels really hopeless, right? Probably not something to resolve. Yeah. Patience. Yeah.
I mean, sort of, if one sort of actually takes the long view and takes a step back, the fact that Primrose becomes a member of parliament is a step in that there's a member of the movement in place to be able to make strategic decisions and to push from that table, and that the movement goes on. And even though they're tired, it's an ongoing, this sort of, like in the scenes around the film, there's always younger women, there's children sitting there observing. And so effectively one gets a clear sense that this is not something that's finished, that's not something that's done, and that people will keep on iterating. And actually they mention trying. And in that sense, that moment at the end, in effect, was a sort of, and also, it was that sort of affective moment of you're tired, and this sort of like labor of caring for others and solidarity. But I didn't read it as something that's done. It's something that's ongoing, and that was a moment of respite.
Definition of like Goliath and David, so the scale of the movement in relation to what are generally broader issues of inequality is also something that is going to keep hindering, I think, in many ways. So we also have to, I think in those, in the kind of politics, we have to consider the politics of scale as well. So, Sekhala Sonke, in relation to many movements, how do you make a movement national, international, and so on? Because you're fighting with international giants. And so that, so those scales also become important. And I love how they bring that in, Goliath that keeps stomping on us. I think that's kind of the word she used in the film. But yeah.
Scale is also interesting when we think about the power of social media as an activist tool. And I think I think it's really important that you've included those earlier images, those activist images, because we've seen in the Fees Must Fall and the Roads Must Fall protests and various other sort of social protests, the activists drawing on earlier generational knowledge. So you see the sort of diachronic transmission of these activist knowledges across generational lines, because it's made available in these moments of activist intensity through social media. And we've seen a lot of sort of culture jamming around those images being redeployed in more recent moments. And certainly that's stuff that Tokelos Sensels is also really good at, drawing on those sort of embodied memories of the anti-apartheid struggle in the way in which it's deployed visual media and the internet as well. So I think that in terms of scale, the work that people were able to do during the apartheid years and with like the 1956 Women's March prior to the internet is astonishing. But it is interesting how that sort of there's been various waves of resurgence more recently around that social media has enabled, that hopefully will continue to help rather than obfuscate or hinder or misinform, as we also unfortunately see.
That sort of came to mind is that meeting of the alternative mining endeavor as this site and space where people could share in their experiences, and that Marikana struggle is not isolated. It's in dialogue with other people across the continent that are having similar struggles. And if we think now that minerals, at least sort of Southern African setting, minerals like platinum, effectively of which South Africa, has one of the sort of has the most reserves, at least in the, you think about the Democratic Republic of Congo and cobalt becoming sort of really this sort of strategic commodity, effectively for a sort of new industrial age of saving our planet and all these sort of climate concerns, is that, these struggles in places like Marikana, effectively, they are a microcosm, effectively, as you said, this big Goliath struggle for something that actually, and commodities and resources that are effectively going to help us shift from this sort of fossil fuel economy. So they're not marginal. They are calling for justice. They're calling for equality. They're calling for better services and a decent life. And that effectively is what platforms like, like here where we are, sort of digital platforms, but also the alternative mining endeavor, translate actually into a policy outcome when they mention the Africa mining vision, something that gets pushed there. It might not have been there, but it's there. And I think it's great.
Of scales that are all reflected on is incredibly important, as well as thank you, Helena, for linking back to the historical film employs. And in this connection, I think we have time only for one question, and I would like to ask a general question related to the points with which we began the discussion, and that is the question about the links and relationship between feminist activism today in Southern Africa and protests around labor issues. So how do you see them linking or existing in parallels? Where are the possibilities for dialogue between feminism and labor activism? Whoever would like to start.
I think that it's like central, because if one thinks feminism, and in particular women's labor, has been thought of as a site of sort of social reproduction, right? Sort of reproducing our societies and thinking about, sort of general societal well-being and all, centering those in dialogues and thinking about where the world goes in terms of work and all, I think is key. And you see that quite clearly in Marikana when they think about water, housing, and these very sort of necessary sort of social infrastructures that are necessary for reproduction, but they require work. They require to be made, and they require people to invest in them.
Thank you. Maybe in terms of also visual language and language of protest, do you see a possibility, even if the links are not there yet, maybe in terms of drawing on earlier repertoires? Do you see this?
When I was thinking about this question, I kept coming back to domestic labor and paid and unpaid domestic labor, and the really interesting work that a whole lot of feminist artists, visual activists, aesthetic activists are doing around domestic labor. And the people who came to mind include Mary Sabande's work, obviously, Usha C. Jarem, even Zanele Mahole's work, a lot of the more recent stuff. And then I just came across a film called Good Madam, which is a film that was co-scripted by Jenna Bass, Babawa Bartman, and Misa Kosa. And it's a horror film that deals with domestic labor in South Africa. And I haven't seen the film. Obviously, it just premiered at the end of last year at the Toronto Film Festival. But it engages this question of the intergenerational transmission of the trauma of domestic work, and it casts it through a horror film lens, which I thought was really interesting because of the potential of this genre to perhaps reach a wider audience to engage with this question. But anyways, yeah, there's a lot of really interesting things, I think, happening around domestic work in particular.
Not necessarily as a whole, but there's I think quite a lot of artists are bringing that in very interesting ways. And others, are sort of thinking about this sort of temporariness of these uninhabitable places. So Lungiswa Gunta, for example, a lot of the domestic objects that come into her work are actually, become sort of objects that are used in protest. So, for example, the beer bottles are like Molotov cocktails, barbed wire, like the brushes. I have matches where if you used it, you would light a fire. So, and all of those things are things that are used in protests. There's very interesting ways in which they're linking ways of talking about different types of violence, but also in terms of this notion of home, and particularly the structure of the shack. I've seen quite a lot of artists use that in their work. And for me, I think one of the sort of really significant moments, in my context at UCT, was the Shackville protests, and where, of course, the shack was placed centrally on campus. But yeah, that's.
Thanks so much also for mentioning those tropes and those genres that are being used today in different ways from the past, maybe, to speak about this intersections of the domestic and the public and labor and activism around gender issues. I would like to thank all the participants of the discussion today. I'm afraid we have to finish now, as far as I understand. We're running out of time. So thank you so much also for organizers at the Zuid-Afrikahuis for hosting this discussion today. And thank you for everyone who followed. Thank you for your questions as well. I hope you all enjoyed it.
Well, that was it for today. I hope you enjoyed it just as much as I did. Stay tuned for our upcoming episodes, which will be somewhere around June. We still have to conclude some things, so please follow our social media and website to stay up to date. The topic will most likely be about the diversity of gender experiences in our beautiful Rainbow Nation. Have a good evening.